So we've talked about all the kinds of fraud there are, and we've talked about how to prevent and detect it. We've talked about investigating it. Last chapter of the book is about getting into court, right? As a fraud investigator, you may be called upon to provide witness testimony of what you found in your investigation, or you might be called upon to be an expert witness to talk about crime in general or this crime and evidence in particular. So we need to be familiar with the court system. All right, so there's layers of court, all right? And it kind of starts with 2 levels, right? Depending on what kind of crime occurred, right? If we're talking about fraud, I mean, there's all kinds of things that go to court, right? You can get a traffic ticket, or you can get divorced, or you can get bankruptcy. There's all kinds of things that go to court. But when we're talking about a law being broken, there's state level and there's federal level, right? So state courts handle most legal cases, including most fraud cases, because the crime was a state level crime. Now, it is possible to commit a federal crime, right? You use the U.S. Postal Service to commit your crime. That's a federal agency, right? You committed your crime at a national park, right? So anything that's federal, okay? And many kinds of frauds are going to violate a federal crime. So a federal court would handle something that involves federal laws. And it can also cover things that cross states, right? It's like, well, this isn't this state or this state. These 2 states together, we'll define that. So different laws mean different courts, okay? So state courts, there's some what we'd call lower courts, misdemeanors, things like that, small things, any kind of civil case below some dollar amount. Different states, cities, counties have different courts. Some places have housing courts, some places don't, right? So every place is going to have a small claims court. Probate courts, that's when there's a will to be probated, right? Somebody's died and they're dividing up the estate. So there's all different kinds of courts. So lower courts, smaller dollar, smaller crime, right? Higher courts, general jurisdiction, so felony cases, your bigger civil suits. Sometimes there's a panel of judges. So higher crime, higher court. An appellate court, again, these are all states. You have lower, higher, now a state appeals court. So sometimes when we come to the end of a court case and it's decided, somebody's not happy with how it turned out. So they can appeal, maybe, depending on why they want to appeal. So there's a court that's called an appellate court, and that's who you appeal to. You say, hey, they found me guilty, but I don't think I'm guilty, and here's why. And maybe that appellate court will hear it and overturn it. Right? So state courts differ, but here's kind of a general idea, right? So there's traffic court, criminal court, so your lower courts, domestic relations, so obviously getting a divorce, adopting a kid, right? So a lot of these things are going to take place in the courts. County or municipal courts, probate courts, small claims, housing, lower courts. Higher courts are your, bigger felonies, a bad crime, not just a little minor crime. Graffiti might be a minor crime. Murder would be a higher crime, right? And then, of course, the appellate. And then there's usually some highest level, like a state Supreme Court, right? So there's an appellate court and a state Supreme Court, and sometimes you don't agree with the appellate court. So you can go on to the final and last court. Federal courts. So federal courts are for federal level laws, all right? So if you break a law in the state of Texas, you're going to go to a Texas court. You're typically not going to a Texas law. But if you violated some federal statute, financial statement fraud, that would be a federal crime. The SEC would want to get you in trouble. So financial statement fraud would typically go to a federal court. Because they're enforcing a federal law, right? They're enforcing the SEC's regulations. Those are federal laws. So you could have criminal or civil cases, and there is an appeals court. There are 13 circuit courts that handle several states apiece, and depending on what state you're in, you'd go to that circuit court to appeal. And in the United States, the final appeals court is the United States Supreme Court. And if you can convince them to hear your case, you could appeal there. So here's how federal courts work. There's bankruptcy is a federal law that allows you to declare bankruptcy. So the bankruptcy courts, tax courts, right? The IRS wants to get you in trouble. You want to fight the IRS, you could go to tax court. There's U.S. district courts, administrative agencies. So if you violate the EPA, let's say you're a company and you do some polluting and you violated an EPA registration, that's a U.S. administrative agency. You could go to that court. And of course, if any of these courts decide something that you don't like, you could appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals. And if you don't like what the appeals court claims, what the appeals court says, you can go maybe to the Supreme Court if you can get them to accept your case. All right. So the next video, we're going to talk about civil courts.